Hello and welcome to month 11. We are foundation paper piecing, which you guys should all be pros at. I have my foundation papers cut out and ready to go. And then I also have my background squares here. All of these A6, A1, B1, B6. So these are all cut out. I've already finished the quilts, so I'm just going to make the block with some extra fabrics that I have left over from a different project. So I'm just going to show you real quick how to foundation paper piece this guy, and then it's the exact same for A as it is for B. So you can choose your fabric placement. There are two blues in your kit. You can see there is a darker and a lighter shading so that you can choose to put the darker blue, in these spots and the lighter blue in these spots, or vice versa, or play with it however you'd like. It's totally up to you. It's your quilt. There's no right or wrong on fabric placement. So I'm just going to go ahead and start with A1. So all you need is a pin, and you need to make sure that your fabric that you've cut out is large enough, 1/4 inch on all sides, then your first piece, and then you want to put them wrong sides together. And center that up nicely. When you have a light box, or if you have an extension table like this, you can put a light underneath your table, and it'll kind of function as a light box. Or you can just hold up your piece once you have it pinned in place. You can hold up your piece to the light and see whether or not it is large enough to cover that whole area. So I have the little extendo light here on the 9450. So here we go. Here's one. You can use a piece of cardstock to bend that back, or you can eyeball it. We're gonna fold the paper between A1 and A2. And I'm just going to fold that, taking a look, and finger press that. So that's pretty close. I'm going to leave it like that, and then I'm going to put my first fabric on there. So I have this little gradation of pink to green, and I'm going to start with the very first pink. And since I'm working with solids, it's really nice because it doesn't matter which side of the fabric I'm using. I am just going to position that on here and make sure that my fabric piece this is so big, is larger than my folded piece here. So I don't know if you can see this faint line right here. This is the area that we're trying to cover. So you also want to check on, and fold it this way and say, oh, yep, absolutely, way enough fabric for my piece A2 that I'm trying to cover. So I'm going to open it back up. I'm going to take it over I'm just going to slide it right over to my sewing machine, and I'm going to start stitching into the seam allowance here, so all the way in there. So if it helps, you can go ahead and draw a line with your ruler and extend that line out so that you know exactly where to stitch. And you can also, do it up there as well. That way you are going to get nice and perfect points. So I'm just going to stitch all the way on this line. Oops. I'm trying to do this standing up. Okay, so there we go. Stitch down the line. And then now I can open it up. And this is when I would press this with an iron, or if you have a seam roller, that always works really nicely. You don't want to stretch your fabric and distort it a whole lot. You just want to press it so that it's open. Or not, like the seam is nice and flat. What you don't want is to not press it, because if you don't press it, you're going to get this little bit of a fold here, and you do not want that to happen. So when you press it, you want to give this a little tug so that you can guarantee that that is going to be directly on that line. So I'm just going to take this over to the iron real quick and zap it with the hot iron. I like to use glass head pins because then I don't have to worry about melting them with my iron. Okay, so now that you can see that this is nice and flat, there's no fold over this seam line here. And then I'm going to take my pin out. And now this is when I can trim this. So I'm going to fold my paper. So my paper and my fabric, everything is all together. And then I'm going to trim this so that it's a nice, perfect 1/4 inch. Push this out of the way I'm going to do this real quick off camera, and then you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, so right here, I have trimmed this seam allowance so that it's a nice, perfect 1/4 of an inch. That way my project will lay nice and flat. So after that, so now I have this, I can open it up, and now we're ready to fold onto the next line here. We're going to fold between A2 and A3. And I'm just going to, I do have to tear the paper a little bit to get that to fold. Just going to eyeball it. If you have cardstock, that works out really nicely. So this is my new line right here. And I'm going to pick my next fabric, which is this one. And I'm going to line that up here and make sure that I have enough covering this entire space. So this one is shaded a little bit darker, so you can see this line going all the way across. That is the area I'm trying to cover. So if you need to, you can go ahead and fold up your project, looking at that line, making sure that you have enough space there. If you have to pick this up and you don't have enough workspace to work on a table, then, pin that in place. And then just take it right over your sewing machine. And again, you want to start stitching well into that whole seam allowance. So you can start well before it and then just stitch directly on that line all the way down. Okay. So now we have our next pink that is sewn. In your case, it will be blue. So now I'm going to press that. Get it nice and flat. Don't want any gaps. Okay, pressed nice and flat. There's my stitching all the way across the seam allowance. And then I'm going to fold that back and then fold everything together. The paper is together, so I'm not cutting that, and I'm not cutting this part because we want to keep that. So I'm going to trim this part right here. This is our seam allowance. And we're going to make that to be, if you have an add a 1/4 ruler, that's perfect. If you don't, you can use the 1/4 inch on any ruler, and it will be perfectly fine. Okay, so now I've trimmed that to be a 1/4 of an inch all the way across. And now when I flatten my fabric back out, I know that it's covering the entire section of A3. So we're going to do this all the way across. Next is A4. So I'm going to fold it directly on A4. Ooh, I got a little close. So there is my fold. And now I'm going to pick my next fabric, which is this one, and make sure that my next area here is going to be completely covered. That looks a little too close. I'm going to shift it down. And then make sure that this area is completely covered right here. Okay, so once that looks pretty good, we are going to stitch all the way over this one, including the seam allowance. Nice and straight seam. Okay. So stitch it all the way across. Open it up. There it is. I'm going to, again, I always have my iron right next to my sewing machine so that you can make sure that you get that nice and straight. So there's my seam there. I'm going to trim this so that it's a 1/4 of an inch. Really quickly, I'm going to trim off some of the extra of these blocks because they're so big. So there is my next piece right there. So A3 and A4 are done. So now we're going to be working between A4 and A5. So I'm going to fold the paper on A4 and A5 right there. And then you can trim this before or after, whichever one works best for you. And now I'm just going to grab my next piece of fabric. I do like to cut all my fabric before I get started. That way I'm not going cut, sew. I can just sew, and trim, sew and trim. And okay, so checking to make sure that this piece right here is completely covered a 1/4 inch on all sides. Make sure that there's enough space so that we don't run out of fabric when we open it back up. So again, starting well into the seam allowance, going all the way across. And then trimming Now we're going to trim this part off. I like to press before I trim. I don't really know why. But that's what I do. Okay. Pressed. And now I'm going to trim this off right here, making sure that's 1/4 inch. Again, paper is put together. All the fabric is together all on one side, and this part that we don't want is on that side. So we're going to trim this really quick. I put my ruler, if you don't have an add 1/4, I put my ruler right on the 1/4 inch, the seam. So when I trim it, I just put this 1/4 inch line directly on my stitched line. That way you can get a perfect 1/4 inch. If not, you do have to line it up. Or if you purchased one of these really cool custom templates, this line right here is 1/4 inch. So you can just put that line directly up with your stitched line. There, it's lined up nice. Then just trim right there. That's another reason. These are really, really nice to have because they're the exact size block that you need. Okay, so that one's done, all nice and pressed. So now we have our last one here. So I'm going to fold the paper between A5 and A6. Okay, and then grab one of my triangles up here. And we always want to put our fabrics. Fabrics go right sides together. So if I'm looking at my block like this, I want it to look like that. So I'm going to put my fabric right sides together. And then I can make sure that, oops, I lined it up with the edge of that, but it's so big. Okay, I want to make sure that there is enough fabric on all sides of this triangle here. So that looks like there's enough space there. And I can lift this up over here. Definitely 1/4 inch there. And then now I need to make sure that there's 1/4 inch over here. And so that looks nicely placed. So I'm going to leave that there. Push down and kind of slide this right on over. And start stitching into the seam allowance. All the way on the line. Cut my threads. And now that should be enough to cover my whole square, which it is. But since you can see this seam, you know, all this dark purple through the white, I'm absolutely going to make sure that that gets trimmed. So I'm going to pull everything back and trim off all this excess fabric. Okay, trimmed it all off. There we go. Open up our fabric. Now I'm going to give this a nice press. Like so. And then if your block, your printed block, should be the same size as your template, and you can trim this to 7.5. So I don't generally I trim them after I get both pieces done, and then when I get both papers done. So we just did the A block. You do still have to do the B block to do the bottom, and then once I get those done, then I will use. You can use this block. You can use this ruler. You can use any ruler to trim. You want to trim 1/4 inch just on this. So this lighter line, you want to trim that to go all the way across. And your block so that everything is nice and straight. So when you go to line up these two pieces, once they're done, you're going to line them up this way, and then obviously you're going to sew right sides together. I like to grab a pin and then put it, so if these are completely trimmed, you can poke a hole directly through the paper on one side, and it should come directly through the same side on the other. If it does not, then you know that you need to reposition it a little bit so that it comes out directly where you want it to go. That way you know it's perfectly lined up, and then you can clip it in place. So I do like to use this method to make sure that I have everything perfectly lined up. Let's see, maybe right there. No, I'm way off. It's so hard when it's not trimmed. So there we go. So you would line that up just like that, and then wonder clip that in place, and then take it to your sewing machine and stitch it. So that is how you sew your A and B block for month 11. So yep, I do have different fabrics, but you can always play with whatever fabrics you like. This is how our block looks. 2 different blues, a white in the center and white on the corners. So if you guys also have any other questions, please let me know. The setting kits are all available. They're already all cut. You can pick them up early anytime, starting now until you're ready to pick them up. You paid for them, your name's on them. We will grab that for you anytime. You don't have to wait until December 17th and 18th to pick up your kits. So next month, month 12, is the pickup is 17th and 18th, because we're not going to be open on Christmas Eve. So if you have any other questions, please do not hesitate to call, text, or email. We're always here to help. Thank you.